I guess, broadly speaking, social media censorship. And obviously this whole debate got really started again in earnest when Donald Trump got banned from Twitter, and looks like he's been permanently banned from multiple social media sites, and the subsequent discussions that have now started around that. That if you think of it in broad terms, it was a very sort of, anvil-like approach to dealing with Trump's Twitter feed and all of his social media postings. What was the standard used? Why wasn't it done earlier? Why was, when there was a lot of things that he posted in the past which would have gotten a normal user kicked off? And it seemed like, the Capitol riot was the one step too far, that they felt the need to step in, although it's a little bit like, well, it's easy to do now because he's only there for another 2 weeks kind of thing as the president. So now that he's almost a normal citizen, now we can treat him like a normal citizen. And I guess that kind of spirals out onto so many things. So how is it that, they police these things going forward now that they've kind of set a precedent in a way for banning someone who was inflaming situations on social media?
Well, that's right, and I think you've summed it up pretty succinctly there, Ben. I don't think there's really much else that can be said. They could have banned Trump at any time, but they didn't. They can shut down anything they want, even though they say they can't at any time, and they don't. And for anyone who's really done any sort of exploration of the socials, and I'll include LinkedIn on this, which everyone seems to think is a highly professional, clean product. You dig around on them and you find the same things, the same undesirable activities, the same undesirable thinking, and illegal activities, horrible activities are all conducted on the socials. And I think that really is the much wider issue. There's a business model associated with all of these platforms. And it's not a good business model. It's a broken business model. I don't necessarily blame the social networks for these issues themselves, but unfortunately they're the ones stuck with the problem. And, if the business model's broken and it's not good for you, then you got to fix it, or you got to abide by the rules. And we were talking about this briefly last week. I don't think this is a matter of regulation. I think it's a matter of legislation. And we're going to talk about, I think, Section 230 is it in a minute. You've got to make it very black and white, and you've got to make people responsible, because it's weird. If you defame on Facebook or Twitter, you'll have to pay, but the publisher doesn't. And that goes completely against every sort of artistic model, business model, or creative business model that there is. So, and classical media model that there is. So I don't quite, if you defame in a newspaper, the paper is responsible, or the publisher is responsible. And I just don't think we can get around the fact that they're publishing platforms.
All right, so let's unpack that a little bit more in relation to what are they. So the Section 230 legislation in America, which is actually dated, it was actually more designed for actual publishers back in 80s or 90s. I can't remember when it was put in, but there's an equivalent law, I guess, here in Australia, I think, just in relation to publishers being held responsible for this sort of thing. But for the internet and anyone that's on the internet there, it's like how you said, the publisher or the social media sites in these instances are not held responsible for whatever users post on their site. Now, there's the argument that you were just putting forward there about, yet they are publishers, they should be held responsible. The other side of the argument is that depending on how the legislation, I guess, is rewritten to cover this scenario, it could be a blank. It could also have some unintended effects where if you've got say take us for instance, we've got a site, you can write comments on it. Does that mean that we have to now potentially police our entire comments board 24/7 because certain people are posting, defamatory or whatever other material on it. So that would make it, like, if that were to happen, like, I'm sure we'd have a discussion, but I'm pretty sure I'd be taking the comments board down almost immediately if that was the case.
This is interesting because I think that this was the original intent for 230. So people were, back in the early days, were posting. So it wasn't like anyone could post back in those days, which was, I think, the late 90s. But you'd have a news story and somebody would write something defamatory about the person in the story. So the idea was that it wasn't fair for the media company that published the story then to be responsible for an individual's comments, which you can argue is fair enough.
Mm.
However, now the world's moved on. We're 25 years in the future, and I can publish my own story, which is completely defamatory, or I can twist an existing story to troll, to be nasty, to do things that are completely unacceptable. And that law now is working in the illegal activities favour. So I just think it has to be viewed like that. And if the model doesn't work, well, that's too bad for the socials. I mean, the other side of it is that if you really want to close the loop, then everybody who uses the internet has to identify themselves. And, I don't know really why anyone would even be bothered about that now, because they're taking all your data and selling it when you think you're anonymous.
Is it possible though that you think of when something like Section 230 was first written, that it couldn't obviously take into account an environment like the one we're in now and the platforms that we've got now, and that potentially whatever the new version of it is has to be more nuanced than what this one is. Because on the one hand, although I can see an argument for what I was saying before about shutting down commentary out of fear that you'll get sued, the flip side is that they very clearly are instigating a lot of illegal activity because the platforms are allowing it, or not even just illegal activity, just
undesirable activity.
Immoral
activity,
leading people down thought patterns that they never would have engaged in, and that sort of thing, which clearly needs to be dealt with. It's a hard one.
Let's go pre-2010, because that was the last vestiges probably. By then the ball had already bolted, but let's go back, say, to around 2000, between 2000 and 2010. The point was, at any of these stages, this idea of free speech, etc., there are enough media channels out there. The socials didn't evolve because there wasn't enough opportunity for free speech anywhere in a liberal democracy.
Mm.
Okay? And if you want free speech, you can still go to Speaker's Corner. If you want free speech, you can still print your own newsletter on paper and hand it out in the city. If you want free speech, you can go to your local newspaper or local television channel. So none of this evolved because, free speech was under threat. In fact, if anything, we've seen free speech under threat now because of the socials. And we've found rational, balanced reporting under threat because of the socials. Now, once again, don't necessarily blame the companies, but their business models have given rise to this. I do have one question though, Ben, which is interesting. Does Twitter use algorithms to the same extent that Facebook does, or if you post on Twitter, can anyone see it?
Oh, I thought if you post it on Twitter, anyone can see it.
So
I would think. There's
a social model.
Yeah, though I'm sure it's a mixture, because there's a feed, that I'm sure curates based on who you've followed, etc. So I don't know if it's quite the same as Facebook in that sense, but I think there's an element of that anyway. But yeah. I think technically it's just everyone posts whatever, and you can then you can look up whatever you want, which leads me to maybe a final point, and you were mentioning free speech there, is that I just feel like there's also a lot of liberty being taken with with those terms as well, free speech. I've tweeted this out, that's my right to free speech. And it's like, no, actually, you're posting that on a private company's platform, and they manage the platform. They've set the terms and conditions for that platform. They can take it away from you if they want. And, yes, they've got conditions for why they would do that, but actually they could do it whenever they want. And that's the bit that is kind of driving me a bit nuts, that people are actually thinking that they've got a right to free speech on these platforms when, they're not public squares in that sense.
And it's not free speech either. And that's the reason I asked the question about Twitter, because on Facebook, they provide you the audience. You don't get anyone by accident on Facebook. And so that's not free speech.
Yeah.
If your audience is provided by the platform, that cannot be free speech by any definition. If anything, that's preaching, and that's advertising, which is the Facebook model. Twitter, I'm sure, use a similar variation on probably who you like or follow. But, effectively, there might be grounds for Twitter to claim, well, that is free speech. And also Twitter has a slightly different role, I guess, amongst the socials. But that doesn't mean that it should be any more exempt or any more free. So I just think these are very interesting questions, because there's no free speech when your audience is curated for you.
No.
Cultivated for you. That's not free speech. And when you're not open to debate, when you're merely, posting a diatribe and effectively, small-minded manifesto.
And I have to also wonder what the whole free speech thing means anyway, when these people are jumping up and down saying their free speech is being denied, yet they're using some anonymous Twitter handle to say it. And it's like, well, you can't have it both ways too.
No, look, I think there's very few people that actually use the internet for good, unfortunately, as I think the last 25 years has proven. And if anyone doesn't believe me, start up a false Facebook account and go digging. Just, don't be too horrified by the people that you meet.